Today on the show, we are stepping back into one of the biggest questions facing communities across upstate New York right now. Why is it so hard to turn good intentions about growth into real-world results? Our guest is Bill Fulton, an urban planner, author, and former mayor of Ventura, California. Over the past several decades, he's worked inside city halls, led major research efforts at the Kinder Institute, served as a planning director, and advised communities across the country on land use and economic development. His books, including Place and Prosperity and The Reluctant Metropolis, focus on something a lot of planning conversations miss, not just the rules that shape development, but the politics and incentives that decide what actually gets built. More recently, he's been writing on Substack, The Future of Where, looking at how changing work patterns and daily behavior are reshaping the role of cities and towns. Bill and I actually first met years ago when he appeared on my old show Inside the FLX. Back then, the conversation centered on traditional growth debates, zoning, development pressures, local decision-making. But things have really changed since then. And today, we're picking that conversation back up with a bigger question in mind. Are communities struggling because planning systems are broken or because the very meaning of place has changed? As always, if you'd like to contact the show, it's debrief@fingerlakes1.com. You've written books, you've run research institutes, you've served as mayor, you're a planner. Now you're writing on Substack. What's the most compelling thing about writing on this platform versus some of the others that you have in the past?
I was thinking about this the other day. First of all, the power of blogging, I'll call it, is to be able to communicate directly with the audience, right? Not having any intermediaries, not having an editor, not having a publication to go through, just communicating directly with your readers. I wrote for a while on Medium, and that was okay, but Substack seems to be tremendously more powerful. I was able to have many of my subscribers and others from other efforts just simply transferred into Substack. So I have a pretty ample audience to begin with. But also Substack's just really good at internally marketing you and having you find additional communication in additional audiences other than your own. So I've been real pleased that I've had a significant audience increase since I started. I uploaded a whole bunch of my subscribers and acquaintances for starters, but we've gotten a significant additional audience since then. So I'm real pleased. We're getting we get thousands of views every time I write. So that's really good. And it even makes a little bit of money.
Let's talk a little bit about the arc of what you're writing about. The Substack is called The Future of Where. What's your pitch to folks in terms of explaining what that is or boiling that down a little bit?
Human settlements are changing after COVID. Our whole idea of where and place have changed. The fact that you and I are engaged in this conversation, the fact that I'm writing on Substack, the fact I told my grandson this morning, he asked me what I was doing today. I showed him my schedule. It was like Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, right? So our whole concept of how we use place and why place is important to us has changed since COVID. My original idea was I wanted to explore that, and we do explore that a lot. I branch out into other topics about cities and urban planning as well, but that's really the connective tissue is how do we think about place and the locations where we are in the real world after COVID, and how and why is that important to us, and how does that shape both our lives and our communities? I would say both our lives, our communities, and the way our communities are governed and run, which of course has been the subject of my life's work.
I'm curious, you mentioned that change, and obviously COVID changed a whole lot. Some communities still planning around that commute-based world that we're all familiar with. Others really leaning into the walkability, the denser sort of build out, even smaller communities. Is it going the right direction? Are you seeing in your work across the US more and more communities lean into and lean away from that commute-based community building?
Yes and no. A lot of urban planning, and particularly transportation planning, is based on the assumption of auto-based commuting, right? And most people still drive to work.
Yep.
The number of people, the remote workers nation. Well, the interesting thing is that since before COVID, the number of people who work at home full time has gone from 5% to 15%. It's tripled. Uh, that's still not most people, right? So we still see rush hour, we still see commuting, but increasingly in communities, particularly communities that people are drawn to because of amenities, we find more and more more and more planning and community planning around those amenities and around life that doesn't revolve around commuting. As we talk, I'm in Bend, Oregon, which is where my daughter and her family live. Bend has a higher percentage of remote workers than any other city in the country. I think they all work for tech companies in the Bay Area, which is my son-in-law does. And the flight from Bend to SFO is full of tech workers all the time. But that really changes the way you think about community. When I was the mayor of Ventura, California, this is 15 years ago now, I always said the most precious thing about it. And also, my recollection growing up in Auburn at that time, the most precious thing about Auburn was most of the people who lived there also worked there. There was very little commuting. This meant people lived their whole lives there. This meant people were invested in their community in many different ways, right? I can remember doing a community plan in Ventura, and we selected a guy to be on our committee, on our citizen committee, because we wanted him to represent the banking community. Well, he wound up the whole time advocating for youth soccer, right? Because he was not only a banker in town, but he was an official in the youth soccer organization. When you have a lot of remote workers, you can get back to that, right? You
Yeah.
don't have commuting. You have the ability. My son-in-law, as I said, works here in this house that I'm in right now for a tech company in the Bay Area. And yet he's able to shuttle his 7-year-old son around and be a soccer coach and things like that. But when you commute a lot, that's not possible. The flip side of that is that because in desirable places and job rich places during COVID, housing costs went up so much. We see more remote work. We also see more long distance commuters as people, drive till they qualify and live further away from work in order to afford a house. So it's kind of going in both directions right now.
Yeah. I'm curious I want to do kind of the optimistic look and something that maybe concerns you a little bit. Let's start with the concerning side. When you look at how communities are planning generally, talking big trends, what's something that gives you a little bit of pause or a little bit of concern? And then in a second, we'll flip it and we'll go, what's the sort of optimistic piece that you say?
I still think that the biggest problem in communities planning is that, well, let me back up. I still think the biggest problem is the availability of all kinds of different housing of different types at different prices in desirable locations. I still think that's the biggest problem. I see most communities still doing one of two things. If they are job rich or affluent or in desirable locations, they often try to suppress the amount of additional housing that's built. And then if they are on the outskirts, they sometimes welcome housing, even though from a fiscal point of view for their city or their county, it's often a bad deal. So this mismatch of housing and location remains to me to be the biggest problem that I see. And that's pretty discouraging.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of communities, we see this in upstate New York here, especially outside of the main urban areas. A lot of communities will say they want thriving downtowns, say they want businesses back, say they want large employers back. But then the second housing proposal comes on an agenda or a docket, you know, dozens of people are showing up saying, we want to protect our community character. We don't want to drive down the value of our homes, yada, yada, yada. Why does that disconnect happen in your estimation? Is it a communication problem? Is it a misunderstanding or something in between?
I think it's a couple of different things. First of all, people just don't like change, and their sense of their community manifests itself in a very physical way. When people want to protect their community, they generally tend to try to protect the physical characteristics of their community because that's what they observe and absorb every day. What is often overlooked is that if you don't change the physical character of your community, the demographic character of your community is probably going to change, right? So, in a desirable community, if you don't build any more housing, the price is going to go way up. And people like you, if you've lived in the neighborhood in that community for a long time, won't be able to afford to live there anymore. You benefit because your home price goes up. I also think people think that any change will reduce their property values, and that's not true. If more housing is built near your house, and that creates a market for coffee shops and retail and restaurants close to your house that you can walk to, the value of your house is going to go up. So I think sometimes people view property values they use property values as a proxy for things they don't like happening. They assume their property value will go down when that isn't always the case. I've been working recently with a city in Texas that is sort of in this bind. They have a little downtown. They want to improve the downtown. There's a nearby downtown they like. They kind of want their downtown to be like that, but they don't want anything else to change, right? And it's hard to explain to them you don't get one without the other, right? If you want
Mhm.
a market for your downtown, the more people that are in or near the downtown is actually going to help. And that will help you. I think about places like, if you think of, I was just a couple weeks ago in Arlington, Virginia, which is immediately over the river from DC. It was a single family community for generations. The metro subway came in underground. There's been an enormous amount of apartment and condo development right along the subway line. And if you are living in a single family home 2 blocks away, you're sitting on $2 million. Would not be the case if the subway and that additional housing and all those additional activities that drew would be there. So I think people fear that any change will reduce their property values, and they use their property value as a proxy for their discomfort. When in fact, depending on the change, a lot of change can actually increase your property value.
We're starting to see a real push and rally around the idea of zoning reform here in upstate New
Hmm.
York to
Yes.
unlock more housing, to unlock more housing
Yes.
opportunity. When you hear those discussions and when you hear whether it's developers, whether it's electeds, and not just everywhere, what goes wrong with how that's pitched to residents to create that conundrum that we're talking about here?
And it's a really interesting time to be, especially in central New York, with
Yeah.
Micron coming in, presumably generating a lot more demand for housing. That's been pretty well documented. And in fact, I'll be in the Syracuse area in a couple months, participating in the local government conference of the Tug Hill Commission, where we're going to talk about all this stuff related to Micron. It's a generational thing. People, older folks who own their houses and oftentimes own their houses outright or with a very low mortgage, have little personal reason to want more housing or to want anything to change. What we see, the big political shift we've seen in the last 10 years has been that in many parts of the country, people age 40 and under are unable to afford it to buy a house. And this is not limited just to California and New York City. This is true in most cities of any size and in many other places. As I say, I'm sitting in the middle of Bend, 100,000 people. It is the most expensive housing in all of the Pacific Northwest. Weirdly enough, more expensive than Seattle, more expensive than Portland. It's a generational shift, and it is always hard to get older folks to buy into what the next generation needs. We've seen this. We've seen that. We often see this in property tax paying for schools. Why should I pay why should I pay property tax so that somebody else's kids go to school? My kids already went to school, and so I think the marketing pitch is the community you live in and the amenities you benefit from depend on a wide range of people who make vastly different incomes. And if all those people are not able to live in or near your community, your quality of life is going to suffer because these folks are not going to be available. I think that's hard for people to grasp, but I think that's the pitch that's missing.
What is when you think about zoning reform, what do you think the smallest or easiest or most obvious change that needs to happen across the board with zoning?
Well, thinking of upstate New York in particular, I'll tell you something that happened recently in Texas, which is that the state legislature basically, in certain parts of the state, not all of the state, outlawed extremely large lots, and said that in many places minimum lot size could not be more than 3,000 square feet. Now, if you go to upstate New York, all over the place, you see 1 acre, 2 acre, 5 acre zoning, right? That is a recipe for sprawl. That's a recipe for traffic. It's fine in a world where there aren't very many people and there's not very much growth, which is what we've
Yeah.
seen for my entire lifetime in upstate New York. But if all of a sudden you're flooded with additional people, additional growth, and additional housing demand, you've got to have development that occurs at higher density than 5 acre, 3 acre, or 5 acre lots. So that's the kind of thing that can unlock the market. There will clearly be a market in central New York, especially in the next 10 years for more housing with smaller lots than many rural areas currently allow. So that's just one. I'm not sure if there's a magic bullet,
Yeah.
but that's just one example. And if Texas can do it, my God.
Yeah. So there's one that we hear a lot about now up here that to me, I'm not sure it will have the impact that some folks who argue for it will. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. ADUs, allowing accessory dwelling
Hmm.
units.
Hmm.
It's viewed, especially in a lot of smaller communities, as a silver bullet. But, in most counties across upstate New York, we're between 10 and 20 years behind in building, and housing supply is just so, so, so far behind. It feels a bit like throwing a penny into the ocean and expecting it to rise, increase water levels. Is ADUs a bit overstated when government folk get together and start talking about the things they can do to unlock housing?
It's tempting to think of ADUs as the magic bullet because it's a relatively, it's not putting apartment buildings next to a bunch of single family homes, right? It's a relatively small increase in density. I think there's a pro and a con to this, and you kind of have to accept the con to get the pro. In California, about 9 years ago, the state changed the law so that ADUs are required everywhere by right. By which I mean to say, you don't go to the planning commissioner or anything. You just get your building permit and you build it. This has really increased the number of ADUs in the state. The number of ADUs per year in Los Angeles went from hundreds to tens of thousands. The flip side is, are they all really being used as rentals? And nobody knows the answer to that. At UC San Diego, where I'm a professor of practice, we're currently working with Zillow to try to figure that out. A lot of people will build ADUs basically as an office, as an extra bedroom, as a place to park their mother-in-law or their teenage kid that they don't want in the house. That's not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing. I think ADUs are part of the solution. And they're a pretty easy part of the solution to fix. They're not the only thing that will solve the problem.
I'm curious. The last time we talked a lot about place and prosperity. Your book, you argue in it that place really is what shapes your economic outcomes. What idea from that book do you think holds up strongest today?
Because I wrote that book mostly before and during COVID, and now we're after COVID. I think the thing that holds up strongest is that, well, in the book, I sort of talk about it both ways. Place affects prosperity and prosperity affects place, right? And I use the example of in upstate New York, whenever I saw a factory on the edge of town that was actually open, I saw a healthy downtown in the small town. I got this idea. I can remember once driving up Route 12 from Binghamton to Utica. I would drive through Norwich and places like that, Green,
Yeah.
places like that. A bunch of my relatives come from that area. But I think the thing that holds up the most is that there is a market for high amenity communities, and high amenity now means walkability and access to town centers, to coffee shops, to community amenities, not in a car. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to drive most places. That doesn't mean people aren't going to have cars, but it does mean people like to have access to more of a community. There's no question in my mind that there's more demand for that than there is supply. People want it, but we build very little of it. I can tell you a funny example of market response to that. I was moderating a panel of developers in Texas a few years ago. These were master plan community developers. They were used to building golf course communities. They were older guys like me. And they said, well, people used to want to live along a golf course. Now they want to live near a town center. We don't understand why. That makes no sense to us, but they want it, so we'll build it for them. And so I think the most enduring thing from place and prosperity is that there is a market for high amenity places in a different way than there used to be. More walkability, more traditional towns, and that intersects with prosperity in a much more powerful way than it did certainly a generation ago.
Communities that are struggling right now or feel like they're struggling right now, whether they're small, medium, large, whatever the size, what would you tell them to focus on first if you were giving them a little piece of advice? Because all of these issues, we're talking about housing, but as soon as you start talking about housing, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about what the community looks like. It can really sort of spider webs out. And all of a sudden, you're trying to solve for 15 problems instead of solving for one. What would be, if there's one thing to focus on first or one place to put your energy first, where would that be?
I would say it's understanding your role in the regional economy, right? Uh, are you or could you be a job center? Are you simply going to be a residential suburb? Even if you're 200 years old, like some communities in upstate New York are,
Yep.
are you essentially, used to be a little town? Are you now a residential suburb? Um, do you have the capability to attract certain kinds of businesses? I would say that's where you start. The encouraging thing is that the economy in upstate New York is more promising than it's been in decades. And remember, 7 million people or something like that live in upstate New York. It's not a little place. That's more people than live in most states, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely an economy there. But, let's say you are in a rural town outside of Syracuse or Rochester, 20 miles away. Your town was created in the 19th century when you had a little general store and things like that, and you don't anymore. What really is your role? Are you really just a residential suburb? Can you be a retail center or not? And you have to be very realistic about that. You have to be very hard nosed about that. I think that is where, or can you be, if you are a Norwich, right? 10,000 people, do you actually have, what economic assets do you have? Do you actually have a factory that's still operating? If so, how does that drive your local economy and interact with it? I think it starts with an economic understanding of your role in the region and the role that you're going to play, and particularly, take in central New York, the role you're
Yeah.
going to play as Micron comes in. If the tech hub thing ever happens, which may or may not, given the changing federal priorities, what role are you going to play, and position yourself to play that role instead of just allowing whatever the growth is coming to roll over you, and create, possibly an untenable situation.
Yeah.
That's hard to do. That's hard to do if you're a little village or a little town in upstate New York, which the government entities there don't have a whole lot of capacity, right?
Well, okay, so you bring up a good point. And I'm curious, from what you're seeing and hearing and reading, do you get the impression that communities that will, see benefit down the road from Micron are appropriately preparing for it?
I don't think they can do it on their own. Um, I think that I think, and I think the towns are going to have a much more difficult time than the villages, because the villages are used to being geographically constrained and a little more dense and all that. The towns are accustomed to just, some type of suburbanization. I don't think that though, and this is what's going to be really interesting about my visit to the Tug Hill Commission conference in April, which is at Turning Stone. I don't think most of these communities have the capacity to do this. So they have to rely, for example, the towns and villages around Syracuse have to rely on Onondaga County Planning to help them, even though Onondaga County Planning has no regulatory authority, land zoning authority, it can still help them. They have to rely on Center State CEO, the regional chamber of commerce, the regional economic development entity, to help them figure out what their, and I know Rob Simpson's been going around to like every little town and village in all of central New York to figure out, okay, what is our role in this emerging regional economy? And to the extent that you have civic or business leadership in your community, you really have to rely on them because these village and town governments are set up to do very basic things, and they're not set up to figure out how to handle this kind of growth situation.
Do towns and villages, especially smaller ones, do they need to start working more with each other? Is that a
Oh,
piece? Is
sure.
that
Yeah, I definitely think so. That's hard to do.
yeah?
They tend not to want to do it, but certainly if you think of, I don't know, Western Onondaga County, Eastern Cuyahoga County, just to take an example, those towns are going to play a particular role in the emerging economy. They're not close to Micron, but they would do well to work with the regional economic development leaders to figure out, okay, what role are we going to play? I think that's going to be the topic of the Tug Hill Commission too. What those towns up there north of Micron, what role are they going to play? Right? Are they just going to be residential suburbs, or is there something more? Are you gonna go to Micron and then do all of your shopping at Target and Cicero and then drive back up to Tug Hill, um, or is there going to be something more to it than that?
Yeah.
And I don't know the
Uh,
answer to that.
it'll be interesting to see how this evolves, especially in the next 5 or so years. Last question for you. I want to get the crystal ball out. If we fast forward 10 years from now, when we look back, what do you think we will, if there's anything that we will have misunderstood about today's housing debate, how it's happening, what might that be?
I think what we've misunderstood, I hate to say this as a land use planner, but I think one of the things we're going to misunderstand is that zoning reform is going to solve everything. Zoning reform unlocks certain opportunities. The market still has to fulfill those opportunities. In some cases, the government has to provide money to fulfill those opportunities. A guy I know just was talking on LinkedIn the other day about, you know, a new housing fund for Central New York that has just been created. Uh, One of the things we've learned in California is that zoning reform is a necessary but not sufficient precondition. You have to follow that with lots of other things to make sure that all kinds of different housing actually gets built. And that is not probably just a private sector thing. That's a thing that the private, public, and nonprofit sectors have to work on together.
Bill Fulton, appreciate the time. Thanks so much for taking it today.
Thank you, Josh.